All right, slide 15, axiology, study of values and value judgments. So remember, aesthetics, economics, and ethics are three of the main sub-disciplines of axiology, the study of value. So aesthetics, pardon me, is the study of values connected with judgments of beauty. Is beauty in the object or in the eye of the beholder, right? When somebody makes a judgment like that painting behind me is beautiful, is the predicate, the property being attributed to or predicated to the painting, is it a characteristic of the painting, or is it a characteristic of the mind perceiving and reacting to the painting? In other words, is beauty in the eye or the mind of the beholder, or is it in the object that's being beheld? Similarly, when we think of another subdiscipline, economics, are money values objectively real? You notice, like when a certain kind of events happens, like President Trump tweets a certain thing, and then the next day stock market goes up or stock market goes down, or when he was elected or whatever. The fact that market rates fluctuate relative to human perceptions and beliefs and opinions and attitudes suggests that those things are relative to mental states and attitudes and beliefs, that they're in some way subjective. They're not objective. They're relative to other things. They're dependent on other things, right? Whereas the shape of an object or the weight of an object, that's not relative to other things. That's kind of objective, right? So economic values are of a peculiar metaphysical status, metaphysics being the reality status of a thing. Like the shape of an object seems to be objective, right? But the taste of an object or our attitudes toward the objects seem to be partly at least subjective. You think about ethics, so we did aesthetics, we did economics, now we'll do ethics. The native peoples of Alaska, when I was raised as a child, we called them Eskimos. This is theoretically or alleged to be politically incorrect. They allegedly prefer to be called Inuit people. I don't know if this is true because I remember thinking that American Indians didn't want to be called American Indians, that they wanted to be called Native Americans. And so I used the term once, and there was an Indian present, and he said, "Excuse me, I understand you're trying to be politically correct, but we prefer to call ourselves Indians." So I don't really know if the natives of Alaska and Canada and whatnot, the indigenous peoples, or they're called First Nation because they were the first peoples here, whether they really prefer to be called Inuit or Native American, whatever. I'm just mentioning that so that I don't put my foot in my mouth if anybody cares about such matters. But the Alaskan natives, prior to the white man coming there, used to allow infanticide, the killing of an infant, if a mother had too many infants to breastfeed and carry. It was considered normal and acceptable in that culture to cut a hole in the ice and drop one in. Same thing for patricide, which is the killing of parents. So the reason why this is being mentioned is that ethical values seem to vary from culture to culture. Each culture thinks that their values are sort of universal, but upon analysis, when you compare cultures, they seem to be relative to the culture. In the same way that economic values are relative to various phenomena. right? So the question in axiology, one of the primary questions, is whether or not value judgments like beauty or economic value or wealth, that this is valuable, a valuable resource like gold or diamond as opposed to costume jewelry, or whether or not a behavior is ethically right or wrong. Are those value judgments ways of identifying actual characteristics that are in the objects or events that are being considered? Or are they just attitudes that human beings have towards those things? Now, if those are actual characteristics or attributes or properties of the objects or events, then we call them objective. They are features of the object. If they involve, on the other hand, characteristics or attributes of the subjective experience, which is us, beings who have minds and senses and emotions and attitudes, then we call them subjective, right? Meaning that they're partly dependent on minds and senses and attitudes and emotions and interpretations of the subjects of experience, which are us. I'm the subject, things outside of me are the object. Subjective, objective. Then there's this peculiar third category, which kind of looks like and is almost indistinguishable from things that are objective, but really they are subjective. But all beings who have the same kinds of minds or sense organs, or both, have the same attitudes toward them, right? Like maybe all Italians love pasta and tomato sauce, right? But not everybody does. And all Chinese people like rice and certain kinds of sauces, but not everybody does, right? But if you live in a homogeneous society where everyone is like you, and everyone experiences the same things the same way and has the same attitudes towards them, if you didn't know that there were other societies of beings that view them differently, you would think that that characteristic was a characteristic of the object and that it was objective. But when you compare different societies and realize that different groups of people have different attitudes about the same things, then it seems like those attitudes are relative to the group. They're not really objective. We call those things intersubjective. And it may very well be that some things are subjective for the entire species of human beings because we have certain kinds of eyes, certain kinds of senses of scent, abilities to hear and taste and touch, whereas other species have different sense organs. So honey might be sweet for all humans, but it might be noxious and nasty for a member of another species, right? So those things look objective, but they're really intersubjective. They're subjective for everybody who's a member of a certain kind of group that shares that experience. In the next video and slide, we will have an experiment where we try to apply the ideas of something being a feature of the object, at least partly dependent on characteristics of the subject, or things that look objective but that are intersubjective, where everybody who has the same mind, brain, and sense organs as everyone else in that species or in that cultural group experiences something the same way, and therefore it's intersubjective. Now, whether or not something is subjective or objective or intersubjective, those three categories are metaphysical categories. They're categories about the reality status of a thing. What kind of reality does it have? Does it really exist in the object? If there were no minds or senses or species whatsoever, that characteristic would be there, like the shape of an object or the weight of an object or something like that, right? Or is that characteristic partly dependent on a sense organ in a brain being structured in a way that it experiences that object in a certain way, right? Or that all beings that have that kind of same sensory or cognitive apparatus will experience that the same way. That's intersubjective, right? Objective, subjective, and intersubjective, those are metaphysical questions about the reality status of an experience, right? Is it an experience of the object in itself, or an experience of how a being like me interacts with that object, or is it an experience of how a whole collection or species or culture of beings like me experiences that object, right? Those are reality status questions. What's the reality status? Subjective, objective, intersubjective, right? So those three metaphysical categories are being applied to axiology right now, at least on the slide that we're discussing. Are value judgments objective, subjective, or intersubjective, or are they some kind of blend of each? All right, so let's think about musicologists. Musicologists can talk about characteristics of a piece of music, let's just say, that it has a certain harmony, a certain rhythm, certain tempo, that the vocals are soprano, and so on, right? Those are, in a way, objective, measurable characteristics of the piece of music. Whether or not music that has certain objective characteristics is pleasant or amusing, music and amusing are rooted on the same word that goes from the Greek, the muses, the gods of the arts, daughters of Zeus, the muses that possess artists and musicians. So whether or not a certain kind of blend of those objective characteristics that musicologists can measure, whether or not those are aesthetically pleasing or moving or enrapturing, right? Those questions seem to be subjective or intersubjective. But whether or not a piece of music has those characteristics seems to be objective, right? Now, my son is a musician, and when he was a student at Brooklyn College, he was in the music seminary, or whatever it's called. I forget the name of it. It's a name for the music program. I'm not sure if it's the seminary. It's usually some kind of religious thing, in theology school, something like that. Oh, I wish I could think of the word. But my son is like a kind of heavy metal rocker dude who plays the bass guitar, and like almost everybody else in the program there were like kids who grew up with violins on their neck when they were 8 years old, and wearing bow ties and tuxedos and playing at the Philharmonic, or wishing that they could. And I remember him telling me that his music teachers in the program said that certain kinds of combinations of chords and whatnot were, I forget the word, they weren't resonant, they didn't resonate, they were disharmonic. I can't remember the term, but it was almost like unequal signs in math, they didn't go well together, disharmonic or something. And I remember him thinking, well, I like those kinds of things, and I intentionally try to create them in my music. He's a composer, pretty talented. The name of his group, by the way, is Infinite Spectrum, and you can Google them. Awesome music, progressive heavy metal, progressive metal, really long instrumental pieces like in the group Yes, album Tales from Topographic Oceans. In any event, he was really unhappy with the idea. Discordant was the word, right? These chords don't go with those chords. It's discordant, and it doesn't sound like music. It's a kind of musical error. But he thought like there were intentional constructions of discordant, things that others would call discordant, that's what he wanted to produce, and they liked that. And so like those kinds of judgments about something being discordant, is that judgment objective or subjective or intersubjective, right? Really puzzling. Like I said, in the next slide, we're going to challenge our thinking about ordinary objects of everyday life and make some judgments and try to figure out the metaphysics of those judgments. Are these characteristics objective, subjective, or intersubjective? All right. See you in the next one.